Hey everybody, this is a lecture, one of two related to ownership of forest land in the United States. This one focuses on different categories of forest ownership. I really encourage you to download or work from the Word document of the outline for this lecture. There's a lot of facts and figures and so on, and I think it'll be really useful for you to write down or type down in that outline as you go along, so you capture all that important information. It's not all on the PowerPoint, so I encourage you to. Okay, so the first question to ask is, why do we need to know this stuff? Why is it important to know who owns forest land or natural resources and what the patterns of those are? Well, the reason for that is this. Who owns the land determines what the objectives for that land are. That's it. The manager, the natural resource manager, does not determine the objectives. It's the owner of the land. That seems obvious, but it is an important thing to keep in mind. If we look at mission statements for different entities or organizations that own land, we can see those mission statements are a good place to look to determine how they might focus their management, what their objectives are for the resources they manage. So if you sort of look at these different mission statements, you can see they vary quite a bit. Statements related to health, productivity, and diversity of forests and grasslands, to optimizing value growth, to protecting people from wildfire. Those are all different kinds of entities with different kinds of focus and different ways of managing natural resources. So we'll come back to these mission statements as we talk about the different entities. There's a lot of data in this lecture, and the data come from this document. This is the document that's published every 5 years by the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis, or FIA program. This is something that's required by federal law, that every 5 years the U.S. Forest Service inventories all forests in the United States. Okay, this book has tons of great data in it. If you're a forest nerd or a data nerd, check this book out. You can drill down and find out how many cubic feet of hardwood, roundwood there is in Alachua County. Who doesn't want to know that? It's great stuff. These data come from permanent physical plots located across all forest lands in the United States, on private land, on state-owned land, on federal land, okay? There's approximately one of these plots for every 6,000 acres of forest land, okay? So this is and they're remeasured every 5 years. So you can see in any particular county or region, are forests growing? Are they shrinking? Is there more forest land, less forest land? Are there more hardwoods or conifers? Really great. This inventory system is probably the best continuous forest inventory system of any country in the world. Really great asset. So I encourage you to check it out. Okay, United States, about a third of our country is forested. Okay, that's something that we're really fortunate. We have lots of forests. Of those 765 million acres, about 42% is publicly owned by government entities, and about 58% is private owned. Okay, so that's how I'm going to organize this lecture. I'll start and talk about all the different categories of public ownership, and then I'll talk about the different categories of private ownership. Okay, so let's start with public ownership. First agency I want to talk about is the U.S. Forest Service. That first bullet there, administrative home. For the federal agencies, that tells you which cabinet level officer or agency or department is responsible for this agency. So the U.S. Forest Service is in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the USDA. So the Secretary of Agriculture is the cabinet level officer that ultimately is responsible for the U.S. Forest Service. The mission of the U.S. Forest Service is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. Okay, A couple of important things to note: focus on health, diversity, and productivity. Productivity involves, growing wood, forests, and grasslands. So remember from the Greatest Good video, lots of the Western forest reserves and eventually Forest Service lands have grazing land. So grazing is important. Grasslands are important, especially in the West. Okay. U.S. Forest Service manages 193 million acres of forest land. That's a huge amount of land. That's equivalent to the state of Texas in terms of acreage. So the U.S. Forest Service is the largest public forest land owner. They manage 154 national forests and 20 national grasslands, and that's what this map shows. They have 35,000 employees, and in any particular year, they have in the neighborhood of 148 million visitors. So lots of people visit national forests and grasslands. Okay, the next federal entity that owns forest land and other natural resources is the U.S. Park Service. The administrative home of the Park Service is the Department of the Interior. Okay? Recall the forest reserves originally that the Forest Service grew out of originally was in Interior. The General Land Office was in the Department of Interior, but Pinchot hated the General Land Office, and he worked to get the forest reserves into the Department of Agriculture. Okay, so that was the origin of the Forest Service being in agriculture. But Park Service and the other federal agencies I'll talk about are all in Interior. Okay, the mission of the National Park Service is to preserve unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. The Park Service cooperates with partners to extend the benefits of natural and cultural resource conservation and outdoor recreation throughout this country and the world. That's a long one. You probably had to pause to write all that down. Again, some important things to distinguish that from, for instance, the Forest Service. The word preserve. Preserve, as opposed to conserve, has less of an emphasis on consumption. There are timber sales on Forest Service lands. Really no harvesting specifically for timber on Park Service lands. They are preserving lands because they're unique, either culturally or naturally. Okay? They own 84 million acres, not all of it forested. I don't know what fraction of that is forested. And they manage 400 sites. Those aren't all national parks. National parks are the ones we think about, but they also own cultural sites. If you go to the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., you will see people with Smokey Bear hats there who work for the U.S. Park Service because the U.S. Park Service manages cultural sites. If you go to a Civil War battlefield, those are usually managed by the U.S. Park Service as well. So you'll see the Smokey Bear sites there as well. Okay. They have 27,000 employees and 318 million annual visitors. So lots of visitors. These sites are managed for visitation. Okay, so that's really their primary role. Okay, Bureau of Land Management, really interesting agency, usually called the BLM. It's located in the Department of the Interior, and its mission is to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of the public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. Okay, that's their mission. To me, that mission is very similar to the U.S. Forest Service. It includes words in there that imply there can be some consumptive use of public lands, but also enjoyment, recreation, okay, for present and future generations. So that sustainability piece is there. Remember, natural resources are generally managed in perpetuity, and that's really important. But it doesn't mention forests and grasslands. That's because a lot of BLM lands is not on forests. You see in this map of their ownership, a lot of that land is in desert. So these are really dry lands. Important attribute is they are huge. They manage 247 million acres. That's 1/8 of all land of any kind in the United States. That's huge. They are the largest single landowner of any kind in the United States. About a fifth of that is forested. So 57 million acres of that 247 million acres is forested. And they get about 67 million visitors annually. So a lot lower visitation than some of those other big federal agencies. Sometimes I call the BLM, the biggest agency that you've never heard of, especially in the eastern United States. You see that map in the east, you see no ownership there. BLM does have a presence in the east, but in the east, they primarily manage mineral rights. So that's another interesting fact about the BLM. Okay. This is a map of U.S. National Wildlife Refuges, and those are managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is also in the Department of the Interior, and their mission is working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, and plants and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. Okay? This is a fish and wildlife focused agency. Now, obviously, when you're focused on fish and wildlife, your biggest job is really managing their habitat. So they are, a land management agency ultimately, but their goal is to manage that habitat for the fish and wildlife. They own 93 million acres. Not all of that is forested. I don't know what fraction is forested. They manage 520 national wildlife refuges. So huge number of wildlife refuges. Not many employees. They have 7,500 employees, but they get 40 million visitors annually. Okay. So they manage a lot of visitors with very few employees. That's one attribute of the Fish and Wildlife Service. If you visit a national wildlife refuge, you may not even see an employee. And if you talk with them, they will probably be wearing many hats because there's not a lot of employees. One interesting thing is there are some huge wildlife refuges in Alaska. Very large wildlife refuges in Alaska. Okay. So summary of federal forest land ownership. Forest Service is the king in terms of forest ownership in federal property. Bureau of Land Management and Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service are sort of equal, but keep in mind those Park Service and Fish and Wildlife Service numbers are skewed large because not all of those acreages are in forest. That BLM part, that's just the BLM forest part. Okay? So that's federal land management and ownership. I want to talk about state ownership. If you think about state ownership of forests and management of forests, those are generally state forestry agencies. And those state forestry agencies generally have three responsibilities. They generally own and manage forests, and those are generally state forests. They're generally responsible for forest wildfire prevention and mitigation. Okay, so the responsibility for fighting wildfires, especially in forests, usually falls on that state forestry agency. And then they're usually also responsible for landowner assistance. So for instance, if you owned forest land in Florida, you could go and visit your county forester. There's a county forester in every county in Florida that will help private forest landowners create management plans for their forests. So that's the landowner assistance piece. So those three responsibilities are common to most state forest agencies. There are other ways that states can own and manage forests. So there are state wildlife agencies that are sort of the state equivalent of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So for instance, in Florida, that's the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. sometimes called FWC. They own state wildlife refuges and manage them. University of Florida owns the Austin Cary Forest. That is state ownership of forest land. Then there are other agencies at the state level. So for instance, in Florida, a unique quasi agency are the the water management districts. The water management districts are the entities in Florida responsible for water rights, basically, and regulating groundwater, but they also own and manage land, usually sensitive land that's important for water quantity and quality. So that's in Florida, the state water management agencies. And there are other state agencies that also manage forest land. Counties can own and manage forest land. So for instance, you can go and visit forest land that's owned and managed by Alachua County. An interesting situation is in a couple of the lake states in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and to some extent in Michigan. There's very large forest land ownership by counties. In Minnesota and Wisconsin, basically, those responsibilities for ownership of forest land, landowner assistance, and wildfire prevention and mitigation have devolved to the counties. So there aren't necessarily large state forestry agencies in Minnesota and Wisconsin. Those responsibilities are held at the county level. So you would, instead of visiting a state forest, visit a county forest. If someone came to put out a fire on your private property, it would probably be from the county forest agency instead of the state forest agency. So that's just sort of an anomaly in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And I'm not sure what the genesis of that is. Okay. Municipalities. Municipalities just mean cities, towns, villages. They can own and manage forest land. So they own city parks, forests, natural areas. Some cities own watersheds. So especially in the West, lots of cities are dependent on water from forested watersheds in the mountains to provide drinking water. So my doctoral research was done in the city of Seattle's municipal watershed, which was up in the Cascade Mountains, but was owned by the city of Seattle's water utility for the purpose of managing those forests to deliver clean drinking water to the city of Seattle. So municipalities can own and manage forest land in a number of different ways. Okay, so that's all the different categories of government public land ownership. So let's talk about private land ownership, the different categories of private land ownership. Remember, this is about 58% of all forests. First category would be vertically integrated forest products companies. Basically what this means is companies that own forest land and own mills that turn trees into forest products like lumber or paper. They own both, and they raise trees and grow them and then use them in their own mills. That's a vertically integrated forest products company. These used to be the main category of industrial forest land ownership. So when you thought about International Paper or Boise Cascade or Georgia Pacific or Mead or any of a number of those forest industries, they were vertically integrated. But starting in the 1980s and 90s, that started shifting. And there's a reading for you to read about that shift away from vertical integration and basically splitting off mills from land ownership, mainly for tax and financial purposes. But basically in 2011, the last major vertically integrated company became a different category, and when Weyerhaeuser basically became a real estate investment trust. Now there are no large vertically integrated companies. There's some smaller regional companies, but no sort of national level vertically integrated companies anymore. So this is almost more a historical category than anything. If you read about industrial timber in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, this is the category that was industry. But now industry, what we would call industrial, falls under the non-industrial corporate forest land ownership. And non-industrial just means they don't own mills, or mills aren't a really important part of their ownership. So those are non-industrial corporate landowners. There's two main categories of non-industrial corporate landowners. There's real estate investment trusts, or REITs, and timber investment management organizations, or Teemos. So REITs and Teemos. So REITs are real estate investment trusts. There's probably four big ones: Rainier, Weyerhaeuser, Longview Fiber, and Potlatch. There used to be a fifth one, Plum Creek, but Weyerhaeuser bought Plum Creek a number of years ago and became an enormous REIT. REITs were initially a category of corporation that like owned shopping malls and apartment buildings for investors and managed that real estate. But starting in the 90s, these timber owning organizations began becoming REITs. And again, that reading in your readings will tell you why and how that happened. But basically a lot of those what used to be industrial landowners became REITs. Their objectives are still profit, but they can profit either from selling timber, but they also sometimes profit from selling real estate or developing real estate. So if you think about a REIT like Rainier owning timber near Jacksonville, they may be able to make more money by selling that timberland near Jacksonville to be developed for other uses. But then they typically take the proceeds from those real estate sales and reinvest it in timberland elsewhere. So they might sell timberland near Jacksonville and sell it for $20,000 an acre, and then go buy new timberland in southwestern Georgia for $1,500 an acre. So very often, the profit they get is reinvested in other timberland. Some of that profit goes to investors in dividends, but some of it is also reinvested in new timberland. Okay, so that's REITs. Generally, REITs are managing land for the long term. So in that way, they somewhat resemble the previous vertically integrated companies, some of whom own land for decades and decades. And the REITs are roughly similar to that in their focus. They have a fairly long-term focus. The Timber Investment Management Organization, or Teemos, manage forest land for corporate investors. So corporate investors are huge companies like insurance companies or retirement funds. So funds like John Hancock, or retirement funds like TIAA-CREF, which is a big teacher retirement fund. They own everything, and they invest in a wide range of investments. And to diversify, one of the categories of investments they might have would be timberland. Okay, well, John Hancock, the insurance company, doesn't know anything about how to grow trees. So they hire a Teemo to help them purchase timberland, and then the Teemo manages that timberland for them. Okay, so an example of a Teemo is RMS, Resource Management Services, RMS. They manage timberland for corporate investors. Their objective is a return on investment for institutional investors, either from timber or from eventual sale of that land. A slight difference is that often, but not always, the investment horizon for Teemos is shorter than that for REITs. So their investment horizon is often in the 10 or 15 year range. So they might have a shorter investment horizon than the REITs have. Okay, so that's the two sort of what you might think of as corporate categories of forest land owners. Another category of private land ownership are non-governmental organization, or NGOs. Okay, these are private entities that purchase and manage forest land and other ecosystems, often for conservation purposes. Probably the most famous NGO is the Nature Conservancy. The Nature Conservancy purchases land and manages it for conservation, usually of unique biodiverse habitats. Another example of a non-governmental organization in the area is the Alachua Conservation Trust. The ACT, or Alachua Conservation Trust, is a local NGO that purchases and manages land for conservation purposes. So that's NGOs. The final category of private land ownership and management is non-industrial private forest land ownership. NIPFs is what they're often called. This is a huge category. NIPFs, non-industrial private forest land owners, own almost half of all forests in the United States. Okay, so this is a dominant category. Recall, private landowners own about 58% of all forest land in the United States. Well, NIPFs own almost half. Okay, so they're a big chunk of that private land ownership. An attribute of NIPFs is that you can't generalize them. You couldn't say anything about all NIPFs. You couldn't say, oh, they all manage land for conservation, or oh, they all manage land for private, or oh, they all own small tracts. None of that is true for all NIPFs. Some NIPFs are farmers who might own 50 acres of land in the corner of their farm that they keep in forest. Some NIPFs may own 20,000 acres of forest that they manage very intensively for profit. Some NIPFs may be absentee landowners that never see the land. Some NIPFs, own 75 acres in Levy County with a cabin on it that they manage for hunting, and any other objective or use that you can imagine. So it's very difficult to categorize NIPFs. They're very diverse. And because of that, it's very difficult to get your arms around what they need. But at the same time, they may be the most important category because in aggregate, they own more forest land than any other sort of single category. Okay, so NIPFs are really important land owners. Okay, so this is sort of the big breakout. I like this graph because it sort of puts it all into perspective. If you added all of these up, these should add up to about that 700 something million acres of forest land in the United States in terms of category. And you'll see, again, NIPFs are really important, and the Forest Service is really important. BLM owns a lot of forest land, but in aggregate, it's only about 6% of all forest land. So again, if you think about corporate landowners, sometimes people, for instance, worry about corporate landowners, but in aggregate, they're only about 9% of all landowners is owned by Rainier and Weyerhaeuser and Potlatch and the others. Okay, that's 9% is a significant fraction, but it's small in the bigger picture. So I like this sort of aggregate view. Okay, so a diversity of different categories, and understanding those different categories allows us to understand how forests are managed in the United States.